Nellis Air Force Base, Nevada, 1983. Red flag had just begun. This was not a game. This was the closest simulation of air war NATO could build without drawing real blood. In the skies above, a mock Soviet MiG-23, flown by an elite aggressor pilot from the 4477th Test and Evaluation Squadron, locked onto a radar return. It was fast, high, hunting, and it had its target, an American F-16 Falcon, diving low across the desert floor. The MiG pilot pushed the throttle forward, angling for a high-speed intercept. He'd been told the F-16s were slippery, but fragile. Easy kills, so long as they never got behind you. At 2 miles out, the MiG pilot squeezed off a simulated missile shot, a radar kill. Exercise umpires radioed, "No effect." Too early. The F-16 was still alive. He dove in for guns. 1.5 miles. Closing. The Falcon didn't run. It didn't climb. It did something no Soviet pilot had ever seen before. At 600 feet above the deck, the F-16 suddenly pitched its nose skyward. Its body, still flying forward, rotated sideways. Not a roll, not a climb. It pivoted, flat, bleeding airspeed like a parachute, but never losing control. The MiG-23 overshot. In a split second, the F-16's nose snapped back, locked its gun reticle, and fired a burst. All simulated, all real. "Kill confirmed," came the radio voice. "MiG down!" The Soviet pilot was stunned. He'd been faster, higher, better armed. But the F-16 had executed something that, by Soviet flight theory, should not have been possible. Back on the ground, the debrief room went silent. Slow-motion footage showed the Falcon turning at an angle that defied both G-limits and radar lock logic. It had reversed the fight at 0 altitude. No flares, no stealth, just pure aerodynamics, fly-by-wire controls, and one thing more dangerous than any missile: the pilot's will. And this wasn't a one-off. It was repeatable. It had a name among Western pilots: the flat scissors kill, the Cobra clone, the Viper snap. Call it whatever you want. But that day, Soviet observers watching through mirrored glass understood something terrifying. The Americans had trained a maneuver no MiG could match, and their entire air dominance doctrine had no answer for it. Inside a steel conference room in Kubinka Air Base, Soviet Air Force analysts stared at charts, specs, and blurry photographs of the F-16 Fighting Falcon. Their conclusions were consistent. Their tone, dismissive. The F-16 was a lightweight. Its single engine meant less thrust than the twin-engine MiG-29 or even the aging MiG-23. Its lack of long-range missiles meant it would have to close distance to score a kill. Its airframe, unarmored and relatively small, meant it couldn't take damage. Its design philosophy? Cheap, expendable, American. Soviet planners assumed NATO would use the F-16 in rear defense roles, base patrol, ground support, or backup for heavier aircraft like the F-15. So the Red Air Force invested elsewhere. They doubled down on the MiG-29 Fulcrum, a fighter designed for high-speed intercepts and dogfights at the merge. It had more thrust, better acceleration, and a superior climb rate. More importantly, it carried radar-guided missiles and heat seekers with larger warheads. On paper, the MiG-29 and even the MiG-23 should wipe the F-16 off the map. But they hadn't accounted for what NATO was doing off the page. What the Soviets didn't understand, what they couldn't yet measure, was that the F-16 wasn't just a plane. It was a platform born inside a revolution. American engineers had designed it around a single, radical idea: that the most powerful weapon in a dogfight wasn't speed or missiles. It was position. And to gain that position, the F-16 could do things Soviet jets weren't built to replicate. It had a fly-by-wire system that overrode pilot error. It could execute 9G turns without mechanical degradation. Its bubble canopy gave pilots unmatched 360 degrees visibility. And its throttle and stick were side-mounted for precise micro-corrections during violent maneuvers. In combat exercises, F-16 pilots didn't try to outrun their opponents. They didn't even try to outshoot them. They outmaneuvered them, at ranges the Soviets had dismissed as suicidal. To make matters worse, NATO trained differently. While Soviet pilots drilled fixed sequences and GCI-led intercepts, F-16 squadrons practiced dissimilar combat against aggressor aircraft simulating MiGs, flown by U.S. pilots trained in Soviet doctrine. They knew exactly what to expect, and they had a move Soviet doctrine didn't account for. It wasn't just a theory. It had already killed over 15 times in simulations. And in every engagement, one thing became clear: the F-16 wasn't fragile. It was precise. It wasn't outgunned. It was out of reach, at angles no MiG pilot had been trained to respond to. The Soviets had looked at the specs. They'd calculated thrust, speed, and weight. What they hadn't calculated was what happened when the Falcon turned its nose backward and fired. Soviet air combat doctrine, forged in the jet age of the 1950s and refined through bitter trial over Vietnam and proxy wars, had three pillars. Strike first with long-range missiles. Maintain speed to dictate engagement. Avoid sustained turning dogfights at all costs. This logic made sense when fighting American F-4 Phantoms or older NATO jets. Soviet fighters like the MiG-21 and MiG-23 were fast, hard-hitting, and difficult to track. Their doctrine relied on vertical escapes, hit-and-run passes, and radar-guided weaponry from beyond visual range. But by the late 1970s, cracks had already formed. In NATO's top-secret exercises, like Seville and Red Flag, U.S. pilots were rewriting every assumption with a single airframe: the F-16. This wasn't a stealth jet. It wasn't faster than a MiG. It didn't carry more missiles. But it could maneuver tighter, faster, and more unpredictably than anything the Soviet Union had ever faced. And its pilots were exploiting one key concept: energy management in the merge. In standard Soviet training, engagements began at long range. Pilots fired a missile, accelerated to escape, and rarely crossed inside 5 miles. But NATO was doing the opposite. F-16s closed the distance. They pulled into tight turning fights. And then, at the point where MiGs lost angular control, the Falcon stayed in the fight by bleeding speed and rotating its nose independently of its flight path. This was the beginning of post-stall maneuvering, a form of air combat the Soviets had no operational answer for. And it didn't end with the maneuver. NATO pilots trained with aggressor squadrons made up of fellow Americans flying MiG analogs and thinking like Soviet pilots. They studied enemy doctrine like a second language. They knew when a MiG would extend, when it would climb, when it would break left under pressure. In dogfights, F-16s didn't just win with flight performance. They won by predicting the enemy's next move, then using their aircraft's agility to counter it instantly. This training wasn't theoretical. At Red Flag 1982, a 4-ship of F-16s scored 14 kills in a single day without losing one jet. Most of those kills were done within visual range in under 90 seconds. Several involved high-alpha post-stall turns. Maneuvers MiG-23s and MiG-29s weren't designed to survive, much less replicate. Meanwhile, Soviet designers were still working within old limits. If an aircraft stalled, it was considered out of control. If it bled too much speed, it was a sitting duck. The Americans didn't agree. They trained their pilots to control the stall, to use it as a weapon, to turn the enemy's chase into a fatal overshoot. This wasn't just dangerous. It was doctrine breaking. And for the Soviet command watching from behind closed doors, it meant something worse. Their own pilots were being trained for a war that had already changed. August 1981. Nellis Air Force Base. Red Flag had entered its 3rd week. Temperatures on the desert floor hovered above 100 degrees. The sky, a haze of vapor trails and radio chatter, held one of the most extraordinary aerial engagements ever recorded. Call sign Venom 1, an experienced F-16 pilot, entered the mock combat zone at 18,000 feet. Opposing him, a MiG-23 Flogger analog, flown by a U.S. aggressor pilot trained in strict Soviet intercept tactics. The engagement began classically. The MiG pilot locked radar from medium range. He fired a simulated missile, turned wide, and accelerated into a vertical extension, just as trained. Venom 1 broke hard left, evading the lock, then dove. Instead of running or climbing, the F-16 did something completely unorthodox. It dropped speed, fast. Then it pitched nose up past 45 degrees, held a high alpha angle, and sustained it. This wasn't a stall. It was deliberate nose authority. The MiG, committed to a diving attack angle, overshot. He expected the F-16 to bank away or roll inverted. But instead, the Falcon hung in mid-air, barely flying. Gun pointed straight up at the MiG's belly, a burst. Simulated rounds. Kill confirmed. At the debrief later, the MiG pilot was confused. "That aircraft should have stalled," he said. "It didn't." The instructors froze the replay. The F-16's angle of attack had exceeded 26 degrees, well beyond what MiG flight computers would allow. Its speed? Below 150 knots. Its turn radius? Measured in football fields. And yet, it had complete control. The maneuver wasn't elegant. It looked like the Falcon was fighting to stay airborne. But in that moment, the F-16 had turned the fight around inside of 2 seconds. No missile warning, no radar lock. Just nose, trigger, kill. For Soviet engineers reviewing the footage months later, smuggled to East Germany via KGB assets inside Warsaw Pact liaison teams, it looked fake. No aircraft can recover flight authority from that angle, one report concluded. Another noted, "If true, this indicates a flight control system beyond our current understanding." But it wasn't just true. It was repeatable. In the months that followed, F-16 pilots began incorporating the maneuver, now nicknamed the Viper Snap, into close-range dogfight training. When MiG-23s or MiG-29s attempted to chase into the vertical, the F-16 would brake hard, pitch back, and turn the pursuer into a target. And unlike thrust-vectoring moves like the later Cobra, which bled energy catastrophically, the F-16 retained enough power to escape immediately after the shot. The implications were chilling. MiG doctrine was built around not getting caught in sustained turns. But now, the Americans had a move that made every chase angle a potential trap. Not with better missiles, not with better speed, with better control. It was the first time U.S. pilots had demonstrated that turning inside the enemy's mind was more important than turning inside their radius, and the Soviets had no counter. In a darkened analysis room beneath the Central Air Force Museum in Monino, a group of Soviet officers huddled around a projection screen. The footage playing was grainy, but unmistakable. A U.S. Air Force F-16, nose pointed almost vertically skyward, fired a simulated burst and scored a guns kill on a MiG-23 analog. It then rolled inverted, dropped altitude, and accelerated away, all while remaining under full control. An officer from the GRU shook his head. "It's aerobatic trickery," he muttered. "Nothing more." But the room was silent, because this was not a one-off video. More tapes had come in, via Warsaw Pact liaison officers attending NATO exercises, via debriefs from captured tapes, even from open-source leaks in Western aviation journals. And they told the same story. The F-16 wasn't just surviving close combat, it was dominating it. Back in Washington, NATO declassified select statistics from DACT, Dissimilar Air Combat Training exercises. In a 6-month span, F-16s engaged in over 200 mock dogfights against MiG-23 and MiG-29 analogs. The kill ratio? 8-1. And more than 15 of those kills came from guns-only engagements, most inside visual range, no missiles, no radar, just maneuvering. For Soviet aviation planners, this was unacceptable. The MiG-23 had been designed specifically to outpace and outclimb American fighters. It had longer reach, a faster top speed, and variable sweep wings designed to maintain control at multiple airspeeds. The MiG-29, newer and sleeker, was even more dangerous on paper. It boasted thrust-to-weight ratios that rivaled Western jets, high roll rates, and advanced infrared missiles. But in maneuver after maneuver, the F-16 flipped the geometry of the fight. It baited the MiGs in. It slowed. It turned. And it fired. The GRU's official reaction was denial. In 1984, they issued a report titled "Myth of the Maneuver Kill," claiming that American footage was staged and that the F-16 would never survive in real combat without AWACS support. But inside the fighter command schools, the mood had shifted. Pilots began whispering that the Fulcrum's famed climb was useless against a jet that could outturn it at the merge. Some theorized that the F-16's relaxed static stability, a design trait that made it inherently unstable for the sake of agility, was the true game-changer. Because where MiGs obeyed aerodynamic laws, the F-16 rewrote them. It wasn't that the Americans had found a cheat code. It was that they had built one into the airframe from day one, and then trained thousands of pilots to use it ruthlessly. Still, Soviet leadership refused to adjust their doctrine. They believed in numbers, in missile dominance, in speed. But none of that mattered in a fight the F-16 had already redefined. By the time the Soviets were done debating if the maneuver was real, NATO pilots were teaching how to counter the MiG's only advantages, one kill at a time. Soviet air doctrine, built on decades of engineering prowess and combat experience, had one great flaw. It misunderstood the future of maneuver warfare. They believed that faster jets would always dictate the fight. That the one with the longer reach and higher climb would win. This was the theory behind the MiG-23's blistering speed and the MiG-29's power-to-weight ratio. But in the heat of red flag and Seville dogfights, another truth emerged. Control beats velocity, and the F-16 was designed with absolute control in mind. The Soviets had focused on performance curves, climb rates, max Mach, and thrust. The Americans focused on energy retention in combat, nose-pointing agility, and pilot interface. To the Soviet mind, a fight was a kinetic sprint. The F-16 treated it like a chess match, where one wrong overshoot meant death, and one perfect post-stall turn meant victory. The design itself told the story. Unlike MiGs, which followed traditional aerodynamics and center of mass stability, the F-16 was intentionally unstable. Its center of gravity was placed behind the center of lift, a design that would make it unflyable without computers. But with a fly-by-wire system, the aircraft could execute turns that bent the edge of the stall envelope without ever losing control. Soviet engineers had laughed at the idea in the 1970s. Letting a computer fly the jet is suicide, they warned. But in practice, that very computer gave the F-16 superhuman reflexes. It could roll faster, recover from high-alpha maneuvers instantly, and snap the nose to any direction within a 60-degree cone, even when moving sideways. More importantly, the F-16 was predictive. It didn't just obey inputs, it interpreted pilot intention. No mechanical linkages, no lag. It became an extension of thought. MiG pilots, on the other hand, had to fight their aircraft before they could fight the enemy. Heavy stick pressure, limited cockpit visibility, mechanical feedback. In every red flag tape, the pattern was the same. The MiG chased, the F-16 turned inside, the MiG overshot, the F-16 fired. And that wasn't because of training alone. It was because of geometry and timing. The F-16 could retain higher G loads without losing speed. It could perform sustained 9G turns, something no MiG-23 could match without risk of airframe failure. And with better cockpit ergonomics and visibility, the pilot never lost sight of the target. That was the fatal mismatch. Soviet jets were faster in a straight line. But dogfights don't happen in straight lines. They happen inside turns, inside chaos. And inside those seconds, the F-16 always arrived first. The wrong theory was speed. The right answer was time on target. And the Falcon had all the time it needed. In Soviet training manuals, one idea repeated like gospel. Never engage a Western fighter in a horizontal turning fight. Instead, MiG pilots were taught to strike fast, fire long-range missiles, and break off before a merge could occur. The doctrine was clear. Don't get tangled, don't lose speed, and above all, don't try to out-turn the Americans. This doctrine, while sensible against F-4 Phantoms, or even early F-15s, collapsed in the face of the F-16. Because what the Soviets didn't understand was that the Falcon thrived in the merge. Its greatest weapon wasn't its missiles, it was the way it fought at knife range. Here was the second fatal mistake. The Soviet belief that post-merge engagements were rare and avoidable. Their tactics were built around energy preservation. But F-16 pilots trained to spend energy like ammunition. They'd dive, bleed speed, pull 9G turns, and still hold their nose on the target. And even if they stalled, the fly-by-wire controls would recover flight authority instantly. The Soviets had no answer. The MiG-23, optimized for intercepts, lost energy rapidly in turns. Its variable sweep wings helped only in initial engagements. Once it entered a prolonged turn, especially against a high alpha opponent, it became a victim. And the MiG-29? It could match the F-16's speed and climb, but not its sustained turn rate, and its lack of digital flight control made it vulnerable at high angles of attack. One mistake, one overshoot, and the F-16 was behind you. In 1985, during a NATO ASEVL trial, a U.S. Air Force pilot used a move nicknamed the high yo-yo scissors to defeat a MiG-style opponent in under 20 seconds. He broke off a vertical climb mid-maneuver, snap-rolled into a descending arc, and fired while inverted. Kill confirmed. This maneuver defied Soviet expectations. It required negative G tolerance, off-axis flight stability, and instantaneous nose realignment. The MiG-29 could never have executed it. The MiG-23 wouldn't have survived the roll stress. And that's the core difference. F-16 pilots were trained to sacrifice predictability for positioning. They didn't follow standard flight paths. They created them in the moment, bending the jet into firing angles that should have been impossible. Meanwhile, Soviet pilots followed structured flowcharts of engagement logic. Turn here, accelerate there, avoid stall. But the F-16 was designed to dance in the stall, to enter that danger zone, regain control, and turn the tables. And because of that, every rule in the Soviet pilot's playbook became obsolete the second the F-16 got close. They thought the fight would be over in the first few seconds. They thought they'd fire, peel away, and re-engage from advantage. But the Falcon never gave them the chance. It ripped open the range, it drew them in, and then it ended the fight where no MiG could survive. Inside the turn. By 1986, the Soviet Union had collected hundreds of pages of debriefs, flight tape summaries, and second-hand reports from Red Flag, Top Gun, and NATO's ASEVL AIMVAL test programs. But the intelligence wasn't adding up. Soviet assessments of the F-16, based on early flight data and export models, still framed it as a support fighter. A lightweight multi-role aircraft, not a frontline dogfight killer, even as NATO exercises piled up proof of its air-to-air lethality. GRU analysts stuck to the line that any success was due to numerical advantage or technology overmatch. They missed the real story. The F-16 was the centerpiece of a tactical evolution, and it was being trained to destroy Soviet tactics themselves. One of the most glaring intelligence failures was in interpreting the F-16's role in dissimilar air combat training, DACT. Rather than fight against jets that flew like themselves, American and NATO pilots trained against aircraft that mimicked Soviet MiGs using Soviet-style tactics. Aggressor squadrons flew F-5s and F-20s painted in Warsaw-packed camo, commanded by pilots who studied Soviet doctrine and flew as if they were real enemy interceptors. The goal: expose every weakness in the enemy's playbook before the war ever started. And the results were brutal. In a classified report from the U.S. Air Force's 414th Combat Training Squadron, F-16 units recorded a kill ratio of 8-1 during exercises against MiG-23 stand-ins. More than 15 of those kills came within visual range, with no radar or missile lock. Just guns. In response, Soviet analysts declared the numbers artificial. They accused the U.S. of staging unrealistic training environments, but they didn't understand that the entire point of the training was to push aircraft and pilots beyond doctrine. One Asival trial in 1982 tested the F-16 against missile-armed adversaries with strict visual contact rules. The F-16's result? 6 clean guns kills in under 5 minutes. By 1987, NATO squadrons had shifted their playbooks entirely. They now expected the F-16 to initiate the engagement, control the merge, and finish the fight before backup arrived. And thanks to its post-stall maneuverability, it could do just that. Meanwhile, the Soviet Air Force was still operating under outdated assumptions. Their MiG-23's were falling out of favor. MiG-29's were arriving, but in limited numbers, and often with export-grade radar and avionics. Worse, their pilots weren't trained in post-stall recovery, flat scissors maneuvers, or any dynamic turn traps. They simply weren't told such maneuvers were possible. Their flight manuals prioritized safety and energy retention, not creativity. Even worse, Soviet air defense networks expected fighters to operate with GCI, ground-controlled interception. But in the chaos of a real dogfight, those vectors meant nothing. The F-16's were self-reliant. Their pilots made decisions in seconds, at 9G, under threat. They didn't need instructions. They just needed visual contact. And then the fight was over. The Soviet intelligence failure wasn't just a misreading of specs. It was a total blind spot in understanding how the West had trained a new breed of pilot. Not just fast, not just skilled, but free-thinking hunters, armed with a maneuver no MiG could counter. And by the time Moscow figured it out, the skies had already changed. To the untrained eye, the F-16 was just another fighter. It was light, small, unassuming. But inside NATO's war machine, it was the nerve ending of a larger, faster, deadlier system, one the Soviets could never match. This was the American way of air war. It didn't rely on a single aircraft. It relied on a network, a kill chain that connected satellites, AWACS, tankers, jammers, and pilots in real time. At the center of that chain, the Falcon. Where Soviet MiG pilots depended on ground control and radar vectors to intercept, F-16 pilots operated with near-total autonomy. They flew with Link 16 data uplinks, receiving live information from AWACS aircraft like the E-3 Sentry, giving them 360-degree situational awareness, even beyond visual range. That meant F-16s could enter a fight knowing enemy numbers, altitude, bearing, and speed before they even saw them. But the real game changer wasn't technology. It was how that technology was used. Soviet squadrons operated like chess pieces, moved by central command. NATO's F-16 units operated like wolf packs. They fought in fluid formations. 4 ships could break into 2 pairs, 1 pair into single hunters. They didn't need orders. Each pilot had the autonomy to initiate, adapt, and execute based on the tactical picture in his cockpit. The doctrine was simple: win the first turn or die. And they trained for it. Hard. F-16 pilots flew twice as many sorties per month as their Soviet counterparts. They participated in Red Flag, Maple Flag, and Asival AIM-VAL, massive multinational exercises designed to stress test every aspect of combat. Pilots faced jamming, low-visibility intercepts, multi-aircraft dogfights, and full-spectrum denial. And through it all, the F-16 proved it wasn't just agile, it was survivable. Built from a titanium spine and engineered to fly beyond the edge of the stall, the aircraft could sustain 9G turns, absorb battle damage, and still bring its pilot home. Its bubble canopy gave unmatched visibility. Its single-engine design, while simple, made maintenance faster and deployment easier. In one NATO war game, F-16 squadrons flew 3 combat sorties per day, a pace Soviet airframes simply couldn't match. And then there were the pilots themselves, hand-picked, tactically minded, trained not just to follow orders, but to make decisions faster than the enemy could think. At Red Flag, one pilot explained it like this: "I don't wait for the enemy to make a mistake. I build the fight so that he has no other option." That's what the F-16 gave its pilots: the flexibility to shape the battle, the control to force an overshoot, the authority to kill at a moment's notice. Compare that to the Soviet MiG-29 pilot, locked in a doctrine that forbade deviation from the GCI vector. Even with a superior climb rate, he was blind beyond the radar horizon. Even with R-73 missiles, he needed visual contact, something the F-16 denied him with every turn. It wasn't just hardware. It was a culture of war. A system where technology, training, and trust converged in the cockpit of a single-seat fighter. Flown by a 26-year-old with a HUD, a cannon, and full control of the sky. That was the true American system. Not just a jet, a hunter, trained to win, and backed by the most advanced warfighting machine on Earth. In late October 1986, NATO launched Exercise Northern Wedding, one of the largest naval and air coordination drills of the decade. Its purpose: test full-spectrum readiness against a simulated Soviet invasion of Northern Europe. But deep inside the drill's massive scope, a quiet air-to-air showdown was unfolding, one that would deliver a cold slap to Soviet pride. A select group of Eastern Bloc observers had been invited under military transparency protocols. Among them was Major Anatoly V. Vasilyev, a highly decorated MiG-29A instructor pilot. He was confident, sharp, and curious about the Americans' overhyped Falcon. He was about to be humiliated. During a controlled air combat exercise in Norwegian airspace, Vasilyev observed a mock engagement between F-16 Block 15 Falcons and aggressor aircraft flying MiG-style profiles. It was supposed to be a learning exchange. Instead, it was an exposure. On day 2, in front of over a dozen military attaches and Soviet-aligned observers, an F-16 performed the now infamous snap nose maneuver, executing a post-stall flat scissor that killed 2 simulated MiGs within 27 seconds. The third MiG tried to escape with a high-speed vertical climb. The F-16 didn't chase. It cut throttle, pitched 70 degrees nose up, and fired a burst of simulated cannon fire that nailed the MiG analog while flying backward. "That's not physics," one East German officer muttered into his notebook. "That's magic." But it wasn't. It was training. It was flight control design. It was the end of Soviet illusions. The footage was broadcast in the command tent, then replayed again for analysis. Every Soviet-aligned officer was silent. Major Vasilyev asked to review the telemetry himself. He studied the angles, the turn rates, the throttle changes. His conclusion, reluctantly recorded in his after-action report: "We have no tactical or mechanical analog. Our current fleet is not capable of matching this performance within close-range engagement doctrine." The report was marked "internal only" and sent directly to Moscow's Air Combat Directorate. It triggered a closed-door meeting within Soviet fighter development bureaus. But it was too late. The MiG-29's high-speed tactics had just been rendered obsolete. On film. The MiG-23, long the backbone of Soviet intercept doctrine, had been outturned, outgunned, and outthought in open air. And the F-16? It didn't just win the battle. It exposed the strategic fragility of the Soviet aerial order. Because this wasn't combat. This wasn't war. This was a drill. And in drills, where no one was dying, where every card could be played without consequence, the Americans had held nothing back. Every move was executed at full aggression. Every engagement filmed, studied, and sharpened into doctrine. And what the Soviets saw wasn't just one jet beating another. It was a system of war designed to destroy enemy tactics before the first missile was ever launched. The F-16 had no business beating heavier, faster jets. But it did. Not once. Not twice. Dozens of times. And every MiG pilot in the East who saw the footage left with one quiet truth they could never say aloud. If this was real war, we'd be dead. By 1988, the illusion of MiG superiority was cracking, not just on paper, but in the minds of Soviet pilots themselves. The F-16 hadn't just outperformed the MiG-23 in simulations. It had repeatedly embarrassed the MiG-29, the pride of Soviet fourth-generation aviation. In Warsaw Pact countries, quiet discontent spread among Air Force instructors. Some East German and Polish pilots, after exchanges with NATO under détente programs, reported something unthinkable. Their aircraft do things ours cannot, but worse, their pilots are trained to think. That statement, recorded in a debrief from a Polish officer attending an Austrian airspace protocol review, was damning. The Soviet system had spent decades building fast jets and loyal pilots. It did not build tacticians. It did not tolerate deviation. The F-16 was designed for the opposite. Empower the pilot. Let the aircraft follow. In strategic simulations, NATO war planners began writing scenarios where small teams of F-16s broke through Soviet air defenses, destroyed key radar nodes, and lured MiGs into kill zones, not with stealth, but with maneuver traps. Soviet doctrine had no countermeasure. Worse, internal reports showed Soviet command was falling behind in human factors. NATO pilots flew more. They trained under greater G-forces. They studied their enemy's moves. Soviet pilots followed the checklist. The ideological structure of the Warsaw Pact's air power began to collapse, not from missiles, but from ideas. Because the F-16 wasn't just a machine, it was a philosophy in flight. It showed that a single-engine jet with a high-visibility canopy, digital flight controls, and a fearless pilot could undo billions of rubles in weapons design and decades of aerial theory. And with every new exercise, every fresh kill tape, the Soviets watched that philosophy shatter theirs. They built for power. The Americans built for agility. They built to intercept. The Americans built to outthink. And in dogfight after dogfight, the Americans did both, faster. By the time the Berlin Wall fell, the Soviets had deployed over 800 MiG-29s across Europe. But it didn't matter. Because in every classified NATO study, in every simulation that leaked into the hands of KGB analysts, the same reality stared them down. In a real war, the F-16 would win. Not because it was better armed, not because it flew faster, but because it was flown better, by pilots trained for chaos, armed with the one maneuver that MiG doctrine couldn't counter: choice. Today, the F-16 Fighting Falcon is still flying, not as a relic, but as a living legacy. More than 4,600 built, flown by over 25 countries, engaged in combat on 5 continents, and in every theater, from the Middle East to the Balkans, from Korea to the Baltics. The F-16 has carried the ghost of a war that never happened, but was fought in the skies, every day, in practice. The Soviet Union is gone. Its pilots scattered, its MiGs mothballed, its doctrine dissolved. But ask any NATO pilot what shaped modern aerial combat, and one name always comes up: the Falcon. Not because it was invincible, not because it was invisible, but because it proved once and for all that the battlefield belonged not to the fastest jet, not to the best missile, but to the one who could think, turn, and strike first. The maneuver the Soviets feared, nicknamed the Viper Snap, is now taught across air forces worldwide. A symbol of agility, of pilot instinct, of mechanical trust. And the old red flag tapes? They're still studied by new pilots, by historians, by those who understand that war is not won by firepower alone, but by doctrine, daring, and design. There is no Cold War anymore, but above the clouds, where contrails weave like ghost trails through blue silence, the echoes remain. Because the F-16 didn't just fly through history, it rewrote it, one impossible turn at a time.